Satan fears this about older Christians. Biblical insight. You've seen it, haven't you? An older believer sitting quietly in church, overlooked, almost invisible. People pass by them. They don't lead the stage anymore. They don't speak the loudest. And deep down, there's this quiet question that hurts more than we admit. Am I still useful to God? That silence can feel heavy. Years of faith, and yet the world moves on like you don't matter anymore. I felt something similar watching faithful people grow older and wondering if their strength was fading or just being hidden. But the Bible paints a very different picture. It doesn't describe older believers as weak. It shows them as dangerous to the enemy, not because of physical strength, but because of something far deeper, something Satan cannot easily shake. A life tested, a heart refined, a faith that has been through fire and still stands. As Psalm 92:14 says, "They still bear fruit in old age. They are ever full of sap and green." Think about that. Still bearing fruit, still alive in spirit, still growing. The world may overlook them, but heaven does not, and the enemy certainly does not. Because a believer who has walked with God for years is not someone easily deceived, easily broken, or easily silenced. Number 1, they have endured trials that built unshakable faith. And this is where things begin to shift, because time with God is never wasted, it is tested. Older Christians are not simply people who have lived longer, they are people who have endured longer. They have walked through seasons that would have broken others, loss, waiting, prayers that took years to be answered or seemed unanswered at all, and yet they are still standing. That kind of faith cannot be faked. It cannot be learned overnight. It is forged, slowly, painfully. Faith that has faced disappointment and still chooses to trust God becomes something the enemy fears. Because Satan thrives on shaking people, on planting doubt, on whispering, "God has forgotten you." But what happens when someone has heard that lie before and already overcome it? The Bible speaks directly to this kind of faith. It is not shallow, it is not fragile, it is proven. As James 1:3 says, "Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." Perseverance is not loud, but it is powerful. It is the quiet decision to keep believing when life doesn't make sense. Older believers have learned this in ways that cannot be taught through words alone. They've seen God come through before, and that memory becomes a shield. When new storms come, they don't panic the same way. They remember. And that is exactly why they are dangerous to the enemy. Because a person who has already survived spiritual battles is not easily defeated in the next one. Their faith is anchored, not in feelings, but in experience with God's faithfulness. But endurance alone is not the only thing that shapes them. Over time, something even deeper develops, an ability to recognize God's voice in a world full of noise. Number 2. They know the voice of God through years of walking with Him. There's a difference between knowing about God and knowing His voice. And that difference is often built over years, not moments. Older Christians have spent time listening, waiting, learning when God speaks and when He is silent. They've made mistakes. They've followed wrong directions at times. But through it all, something sharpens inside them, discernment. When you've walked with someone long enough, you don't need them to shout for you to recognize them. A whisper is enough. That's what happens in a life that has stayed close to God over the years. His voice becomes familiar. Not always loud, not always dramatic, but clear. As Jesus says in John 10:27, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." This is not just a comforting verse. It is a powerful reality. The enemy works through confusion, through distraction, through mixing truth with lies. But when someone knows the voice of Jesus, those tricks lose their power. Older believers are not easily pulled away by every new idea, every emotional wave, every shifting opinion. They pause, they listen, they test what they hear. And that quiet confidence, it frustrates the enemy, because deception only works when people are unsure. But a heart that recognizes God's voice has a kind of stability that cannot be easily shaken. This is why their presence matters more than it seems. They may not always speak first, but when they do, it carries weight, because it comes from years of walking, not just moments of feeling. And as that voice becomes clearer, something else begins to fade, the grip that the world once had on their hearts. Number 3, they are less tempted by the world and its illusions. And slowly, almost without noticing, the things that once felt so important begin to lose their grip. The rush, the approval, the need to be seen, to prove something, to chase after what everyone else is chasing, it fades. Not because life becomes empty, but because truth becomes clearer. Older believers have already walked through many of those desires. They've seen what the world offers, and more importantly, what it fails to give. They've tasted success that didn't satisfy, relationships that didn't last, moments that felt big but passed quickly. And through all of it, they learned something the enemy doesn't want anyone to fully realize. This world cannot fill what only God was meant to fill. That realization changes everything. As 1 John 2:16 reminds us, "For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life, is not from the Father but is from the world." When you truly understand that, temptation loses its shine. It doesn't disappear completely, but it no longer controls you the same way. The enemy often uses distraction and desire to pull people away from God. But what happens when someone is no longer easily impressed by those things? They become harder to lure, harder to deceive, harder to trap. Older Christians often carry this quiet freedom. They don't need everything the world is offering, because they've already discovered something better. And that freedom, it disrupts the enemy's strategy. Because a person who is no longer chasing the world is far more focused on God. And when that focus deepens, it begins to show up in one of the most powerful ways possible, through prayer. Number 4, their prayers carry depth, persistence, and spiritual authority. There is something different about the prayers of someone who has walked with God for years. It's not about using perfect words. It's not about sounding impressive. In fact, many times it's the simplest prayers, but they carry weight, because those prayers come from history, from tears, from nights when no one else saw them crying out to God, from moments when prayer was all they had left, and God met them there. Older believers have learned not to give up quickly in prayer. They've seen answers come after waiting. They've learned that silence doesn't mean absence, and so they keep praying even when nothing seems to be changing. Jesus spoke about this kind of persistence in Luke 18:1, and he told them a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart. That's exactly what you see in them. They don't lose heart easily. Their prayers are not just requests. They are rooted in trust. They don't pray like strangers speaking into the air. They pray like children who know their Father hears them. And there's a kind of authority that grows from that relationship. Not loud, not forceful, but steady, grounded, real. The enemy fears persistent prayer because it invites God's presence into situations he tries to control. And when someone refuses to stop praying, it becomes a constant disruption to his plans. That's why the quiet prayers of older believers matter more than we often realize. They may not be seen, they may not be heard by many, but in the spiritual realm they carry impact. And over time, those prayers, combined with years of walking with God, begin to shape something else within them, a life that becomes a living testimony no one can deny. Number 5. They live as living testimonies of God's faithfulness. And after years of walking with God, something beautiful begins to happen. Their life itself becomes evidence. Not perfect, not without scars, but real. When they speak about God's faithfulness, it's not theory, it's memory. They can point to moments, times when everything seemed lost, and somehow God made a way. Times when they were weak and God carried them. Times when they didn't understand, but later saw His hand clearly. That kind of testimony cannot be argued with. It doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to convince. It simply stands. As Psalm 71:18 says, "So even to old age and gray hairs, O God, do not forsake me, until I proclaim your might to another generation, your power to all those to come." There is a purpose in their years, a calling to declare what God has done, and every story they carry becomes a light for someone else who is still in the middle of their struggle. The enemy hates this, because testimonies expose his lies. When someone says God was faithful then, and He will be faithful again, it breaks the cycle of doubt. It gives hope. It reminds others that their current pain is not the end of the story. Older believers don't just talk about God, they show what it looks like to stay with Him over a lifetime. And that kind of witness, it strengthens others in ways no quick message ever could. But testimony alone is not all they carry. Over time, they also develop something that becomes incredibly powerful in a world full of confusion: the ability to see clearly what is true and what is not. Number 6. They are watchful, wise, and able to discern spiritual deception. There's a quiet alertness in people who have walked with God for years. They don't rush to believe everything they hear. They don't get swept up by every new idea, every emotional message, every voice that sounds convincing. They've seen enough to know not everything that sounds good is true. The world changes quickly. Trends come and go. Even within faith, new teachings and interpretations appear, and this is where discernment becomes essential. Without it, people can easily be led in the wrong direction while thinking they are doing the right thing. The Bible warns about this clearly. As Hebrews 5:14 says, "But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil." Notice that word, trained. Discernment is not automatic. It is developed over time, through experience, through mistakes, through learning to recognize what aligns with God's truth and what does not. Older Christians often carry this kind of discernment, not because they are always right, but because they have learned to pause, to test, to seek God before accepting something, and that makes them dangerous to deception. The enemy relies on confusion. He mixes truth with lies, hoping people won't notice the difference. But when someone has spent years in God's Word, years in prayer, years observing how truth plays out in real life, it becomes much harder to deceive them. They become watchful, steady, grounded. And in a world where many are easily influenced, their presence becomes a kind of protection, not just for themselves, but for others as well. Because when truth is seen clearly, it doesn't stay hidden. It gets passed on, and that leads to something even greater than personal strength. It becomes a legacy that shapes the next generation. Number 7. They pass down truth that strengthens the next generation. And this is where their impact reaches far beyond their own life. It becomes a legacy, not of wealth, not of status, but of truth. Older believers carry something that cannot be downloaded, copied, or quickly learned. They carry lived wisdom, and when they choose to share it, it becomes a guide for those who are still trying to find their way. The Bible shows how important this is. As Titus 2:2-3 says, older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, Self-controlled, older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior and so train the young. There is a calling here to teach, to guide, to pass on what has been learned through years of walking with God, not in a forced way, not in a controlling way, but through example, through quiet conversations, through consistent presence, because the next generation doesn't just need information, they need direction. They need to see what faith looks like over time. They need to know that it's possible to stay with God, not just for a season, but for a lifetime. And when older Christians step into that role, something powerful happens. The enemy loses ground. Because his strategy often targets the young, through confusion, through pressure, through distraction. But when truth is passed down clearly, it becomes harder for those lies to take root. A young person who has seen real faith up close is not easily shaken. They remember. They hold on. This is why the presence of older believers matters so deeply. They are not just finishing their journey, they are strengthening others for theirs. And when all of this comes together, the endurance, the discernment, the freedom from the world, the depth in prayer, the testimony, and the legacy, it reveals something the enemy cannot ignore. A life that has walked long with God becomes one of his greatest threats. Conclusion. Why the enemy fears a life that has walked long with God. So when the world looks at older believers and sees weakness, heaven sees something completely different. A life that has endured, a faith that has been tested, a heart that knows God not just in moments but across years. There is nothing small about that. The enemy does not fear noise. He does not fear quick excitement or temporary passion, but he does fear consistency. He fears a faith that refuses to let go. He fears someone who has seen God move before and will not be shaken now. Because that kind of life cannot be easily deceived, distracted, or destroyed. And maybe that's the part we often miss. Growing older in Christ is not about fading away. It's about becoming stronger in the ways that matter most. Quieter, perhaps, but deeper. Slower, maybe, but more grounded. So if you feel unseen, overlooked, or forgotten, remember this. A life that has walked long with God is never wasted. It becomes a light, a guide, and a force the enemy cannot easily overcome, and that is exactly why he fears it.